June 18, 1954, 8 p.m. Residents of Guatemala City tune their radios to a frequency that shouldn't exist. The voice is static-heavy, urgent, and terrifying. It claims to be broadcasting from deep within the Guatemalan jungle, the command center of a massive liberation army marching on the capital. The voice lists victories. It lists defections. It claims the government is collapsing. Panic sets in. The president, Jacobo Arbenz, sweats in his palace. Military officers start making frantic calls, preparing to switch sides before they end up on the firing line. The stock market jitters. The regime is crumbling. But here is the twist. There was no army. There was no jungle command center. The broadcast was pre-recorded in a soundproof studio in Miami, Florida. The liberation pilots dropping bombs? They were Americans on the CIA payroll. And the entity footing the bill for this entire theatrical production wasn't a rival nation. It wasn't a political faction. It was a fruit company. Specifically, a corporation based in Boston that decided it was cheaper to overthrow a democratic government than to pay standard property taxes. Today, we are opening the books on the United Fruit Company. We aren't just looking at history, we are looking at the blueprint for the modern corporate superstate. This is how you turn a banana into a bullet. Most business schools will teach you about economies of scale. They teach you that if you buy enough material, the price goes down. That is kid stuff. United Fruit Company operated on a different level entirely. They didn't want economies of scale, they wanted economies of sovereignty. When a normal company faces a regulation it doesn't like, it lobbies. Maybe it pays a fine. When United Fruit faced a regulation it didn't like, it literally deleted the government that wrote it. For 50 years, they controlled ports, railroads, and radio waves across Central America. They invented the concept of the Banana Republic, not as a fashion brand, but as a derogatory term for a nation that had been hollowed out into a wholly owned subsidiary. But to understand how they got the power to trigger CIA coups, we have to go back to a dirty pier in New Orleans in 1899. We have to meet a man named Sam Zemurray. He was a hustler who saw a pile of rotting fruit and realised that if he could just move it faster than the laws of physics and the laws of nations allowed, he would become the richest man in the world. Picture New Orleans at the turn of the century. It's hot, it smells of salt and sewage, and on the docks, men are throwing away bananas. Bananas ripen fast. Once they spot, they're trash. The big importers of the time, the Boston aristocrats, only wanted the perfect green ones. They left the turners, the ripening fruit, to rot on the pier. Enter Sam Zemurray. He's a Russian immigrant, poor, scraped together from nothing. He looks at the pile of trash bananas and sees a spread. He buys the ripes for pennies. He rents a boxcar on the local railway. But he has a problem. The train is too slow. If it stops, the heat turns his inventory into mush. So Zemurray doesn't just rent the train, he bribes the engineers. He rides the cowcatcher, screaming at station masters to clear the line. He turns a supply chain issue into a race against entropy. He sells the bananas right out of the boxcar doors in towns along the tracks before they go bad. He makes a fortune on the margins the big guys ignored. But Sam Zemurray learns a dangerous lesson on those tracks. The only thing standing between you and profit is infrastructure. And if you don't own the infrastructure, you're vulnerable. To secure his empire, he needs land. He needs a country. He chooses Honduras. Let's pause to explain the financial mechanism here, because this is where the term Banana Republic actually comes from. It wasn't about the fruit, it was about debt. Honduras in 1910 was drowning in sovereign debt. They owed millions to British and American banks, money they couldn't pay back. When a country is bankrupt, it's desperate. It's like a distressed homeowner willing to sign anything to keep the lights on. Zamari, now running his own outfit called Cuyamel Fruit, goes to the Honduran government. He offers a deal. He will build railroads. He will build ports. He will inject capital. In exchange, he wants two things. First, 0 taxes. Not low taxes, 0, for 25 years. Second, he wants the land concessions. He wants the title to thousands of acres of prime jungle. The problem? The sitting president of Honduras, Miguel Davila, was hesitant. He was worried about American corporations owning half his country. He started negotiating with banks that would limit Zamari's power. In the business world, this is called political risk. Zamari didn't hedge this risk with insurance. He hedged it with a machine gun. This is where the story turns into an action movie. Zamari can't legally invade Honduras. The US State Department specifically told him, do not start a revolution. So he engages in what we might call corporate off-balance sheet operations. He hires a man named Lee Christmas. Christmas is a legend in the mercenary world. A colourblind railroad engineer from Louisiana who got fired, got drunk, and decided to become a general in Central America. Zamari buys a surplus US Navy warship, the Hornet. He loads it with rifles, ammunition, and a crate of cash. He puts Lee Christmas in charge of a ragtag army of mercenaries and an exiled Honduran politician named Manuel Bonilla. One night in New Orleans, with the US Secret Service watching the docks to prevent this exact thing, Zamari slips the Hornet out of port. They sail to Honduras. Lee Christmas and his machine gunners storm the beaches. They capture the port cities. The Honduran army, underpaid and outgunned, crumbles. Within weeks, the president resigns. Bonilla takes power. And his first act as the new president? He hands Sam Zamari the tax-free concessions. The investment in the coup yielded a return of approximately 10,000%. The coup of 1911 fundamentally broke the region. It proved that a corporation could have a foreign policy distinct from its home country. The writer O. Henry, who was hiding out in Honduras from embezzlement charges back in the States, watched this dynamic unfold. He coined the term banana republic to describe this specific type of hell, a servile dictatorship that exists solely to strip mine its own resources for a foreign master. Zamari had won. He was the banana king. But up in Boston, the massive United Fruit Company was watching. They saw what Zamari did, and they were terrified. They realised they couldn't beat him, so they did the only thing big capital does when it faces a nimble competitor. They bought him out. Zamari sold his company to United Fruit for stock, becoming the largest shareholder. The wolf was now leading the pack. And under his influence, the company would scale this violence across an entire continent. Before we watch this empire scale up, a quick reality check. Schools teach history as a list of dates. They rarely teach the incentive structures that actually drive the events. If you want to understand why the world looks the way it does, from the Fed to the supply chain, you need to follow the money, not the politicians. That is what we do on Capital Curriculum every week. If you want to be part of the minority that actually understands the game being played, make sure you are subscribed. Now, let's look at the machine Zamari helped build. By the 1920s, United Fruit wasn't just a company. It was the octopus, el pulpo. And its tentacles were visible from space. The most striking symbol of this power was the Great White Fleet. These were not dirty cargo scows. These were gleaming, white-painted steamships, painted white to reflect the tropical sun and keep the hold cool. They were the refrigeration technology of the era. United Fruit owned the largest private navy in the world. They carried bananas north, but that was only half the business. On the way south, they carried mail, cargo, and tourists. They launched the very concept of the Caribbean cruise. Wealthy Americans would sip cocktails on the deck, sailing into ports owned by the company, docking at piers owned by the company, and taking trains owned by the company to view jungles owned by the company. It was a closed loop, a total illusion of civilization built on a foundation of absolute control. The tourists saw the white linen suits and the cocktails. They didn't see what was happening 5 miles inland in the green prison of the plantations. To understand the monopoly, you have to understand vertical integration taken to its psychopathically logical extreme. Most companies control one part of the supply chain. Ford builds cars, but he buys steel. United Fruit controlled everything. 1. The land. They owned millions of acres. Crucially, they only farmed about 10% of it. Why? To prevent competitors from getting it. They created an artificial scarcity of land in countries where farming was the only way to survive. 2. The infrastructure. In Guatemala and Costa Rica, if you wanted to mail a letter, it went on a United Fruit train. If you wanted to export coffee, you paid United Fruit's rates. They could strangle local businesses by simply raising the freight price. 3. The communication. They owned the Tropical Radio and Telegraph Company. They literally controlled the news going in and out of the region. This meant they weren't just participating in the market, they were the market. They could set the price of labour because they were the only employer. They could set the price of food because they owned the company stores. It was feudalism with a stock ticker. Life inside a United Fruit Zone was a bizarre mix of luxury and squalor. For the American managers, the gringos, life was a country club. Manicured lawns, golf courses, swimming pools, schools teaching English. It was a slice of suburban Boston transplanted into the rainforest. For the workers, thousands of them, imported from Jamaica or recruited locally, it was different. They lived in barracks. They were often paid not in real currency, but in scrip, vouchers that could only be spent at the company's store. Think about that mechanism. You work for the company pays you fake money. You give that fake money back to the company to buy rice and beans at a price the company sets. The company effectively gets your labour for free, minus the cost of the food. This breeds resentment. Deep, burning resentment. By the late 1920s, the pressure cooker was hissing, and in Colombia, the lid was about to blow off. The consequence of this total dominance was that the local governments became irrelevant. If a Colombian governor tried to enforce labor laws, the company would threaten to move operations to Costa Rica. They played countries against each other in a race to the bottom. But you can only push human beings so far. When you treat people like equipment, eventually they malfunction. In 1928, in the Magdalena region of Colombia, 25,000 workers stopped working. They didn't ask for the moon, they asked for cash wages instead of coupons. They asked for medical clinics. They asked to be recognized as employees. United Fruit's response would change the history of South America forever. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a massacre. December 6, 1928. The town square of Ciénaga, Colombia. It's Sunday Mass. The square is packed not just with striking workers, but with their wives and children. They are camping out, waiting for a response from the governor. The mood is tense, but hopeful. They believe the government is there to mediate. Instead, General Cortés Vargas arrives with 300 soldiers. He sets up machine guns on the rooftops surrounding the square. The soldiers are nervous. The strikers are chanting. A drum roll sounds. A captain reads a decree. The crowd has 5 minutes to disperse. No one moves. They shout back, "Long live Colombia! Long live the strike!" They believe, naively, that their own army won't fire on unarmed families to protect a foreign fruit company. 5 minutes pass. The general gives the order. Fuego! The machine guns open up. It's not a skirmish, it's a meat grinder. People fall in heaps. When the shooting stops, the square is silent except for the groans of the dying. But the horror didn't stop there. Why did the army fire? The easy answer is corruption. The real answer is a specific legal loophole United Fruit exploited called the Subcontractor Defense. When the workers demanded rights, United Fruit's lawyers argued in court, "We don't have any workers." They claimed that the men cutting the bananas were technically working for local subcontractors, middlemen who were often just shell entities. Therefore, United Fruit had no legal obligation to provide healthcare, insurance, or safety standards. But when the strike threatened production, the company dropped the facade. They sent telegrams to the US State Department and the Colombian government, claiming the strike was communist sedition. They turned a labour dispute into a national security threat. The US Embassy hinted that if Colombia didn't protect American property, the US Marines might have to land and do it for them. General Vargas later admitted he ordered the massacre to prevent a US invasion. He killed his own people to save his country's sovereignty from the company. The morning after the massacre, the cleanup began. And this is where the historical record gets hazy, intentionally. The bodies were loaded onto the trains, the same trains used for bananas, and dumped into the sea. The official government report stated that 9 people died. Just 9. But a dispatch from the US Embassy in Bogotá, sent to the Secretary of State, told a different story. The US diplomat reported that the United Fruit manager in Santa Marta admitted to him that the number of dead was over 1,000. Think about that disparity. 9 versus 1,000. It's a gap filled with cover-ups, fear, and silence. Gabriel Garcia Marquez later wrote about this in 100 Years of Solitude, describing a train full of corpses. For decades, people thought he was writing magical realism. He wasn't. He was writing journalism. The Banana Massacre was the peak of United Fruit's brute force era. It worked in the short term. The strike was broken. Wages stayed low. The dividends paid to Boston shareholders remained high. But it created a ghost that would haunt them. It radicalized a generation of Latin American leaders. It proved that capitalism, in this form, was indistinguishable from warfare. And as the decades passed and the world moved into the Cold War, the company realized that machine guns in the town square were bad PR. They needed a more subtle weapon. They needed to control not just the land, but the mind. Fast forward to 1950s Guatemala. A new threat emerges. Not a striker, but a democratically elected president who understood accounting. And to fight him, United Fruit wouldn't use a general, they would use a psychologist. Guatemala, 1951. Jacobo Arbenz takes the presidency. He is a soldier, a patriot, and, contrary to what you might have heard, he wasn't a communist. He was a capitalist who wanted Guatemala to actually have an economy. At this time, United Fruit owned 42% of Guatemala's land. They owned the only port. They owned the rails. And they paid almost zero tax. Arbenz proposed a radical idea: agrarian reform, Decree 900. The plan was to take the uncultivated land, the land UFC was sitting on just to block competitors, and redistribute it to landless peasants so they could farm. Arbenz wasn't stealing the land, he offered to pay for it. He said, "We will pay you the full value of the land as declared on your tax returns." The boardroom in Boston went silent. This was the trap. Here is the financial beauty of Arbenz's move. For decades, United Fruit have been committing tax fraud. To avoid paying property taxes, they had drastically undervalued their land on official government documents. They claimed the land was worth peanuts. So when Arbenz said, "OK, I will buy it from you at your declared price," United Fruit was cornered. If they admitted the land was worth millions, they admitted to decades of tax evasion. If they stuck to their lie, they would lose their empire for pennies on the dollar. The government offered roughly $600,000 for land the company knew was worth millions. United Fruit couldn't fight this in a Guatemalan court because they would lose. They couldn't fight it with a private mercenary army because the world was watching. They needed the United States government to step in. But why would the US government care about a property dispute? United Fruit had to make them care. They had to turn a dispute over land value into a battle for the survival of the Western world. Luckily for United Fruit, they had friends in high places. Very high places. Meet the Dulles brothers. John Foster Dulles was the US Secretary of State. Allen Dulles was the director of the CIA. Before they took government office, what did they do? They were partners at Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm that represented, wait for it, United Fruit Company. But it gets worse. The Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs had a family who owned major stock in United Fruit. The US Ambassador to the UN was a stockholder. The government of the United States and the board of directors of United Fruit were practically the same people. So when United Fruit cried "wolf," the State Department didn't ask for evidence. They asked, "How big of a gun do you need?" But they couldn't just invade. This was 1954. The UN existed. Sovereignty mattered. They needed a narrative. The consequence of this incestuous relationship was the launch of Operation PB Success. But before the CIA could land a single plane, they had to prepare the battlefield. Not with bombs, but with headlines. This is where the story shifts from finance to psychological warfare. United Fruit hired the father of modern public relations, Edward Bernays. Bernays was Sigmund Freud's nephew. He understood that you don't sell a product to a person's intellect, you sell it to their unconscious fears. Bernays didn't try to defend the fruit company. He knew nobody liked a monopoly. Instead, he reframed the entire issue. He told the American public that Guatemala wasn't trying to buy land. They were establishing a Soviet beachhead in the Americas. He equated land reform with Stalinism. And the press bought it hook, line and sinker. New York City, 1953. Edward Bernays is hosting a press junket for the top editors of the New York Times, Time Magazine and Newsweek. He flies them to Guatemala on United Fruit planes. He puts them up in United Fruit hotels. He drives them around in United Fruit cars. He arranges interviews with staged dissidents who scream about the communist terror. He carefully shields the journalists from the actual peasants who were thrilled to finally have land. The journalists go home and write exactly what Bernays wanted. Red Scare in our backyard. Meanwhile, in Florida, the CIA is building a fake army. They find a disgruntled Guatemalan officer named Castillo Armas. They give him a pile of cash and a few hundred men. But a few hundred men can't conquer a country. So the CIA decides to conquer the country using sound effects. They set up a clandestine radio station, the Voice of Liberation. They broadcast rumours that a massive army is approaching. They jam the government's signals. They create a fog of war where there is no war. Only a few skirmishes and a lot of noise. The mechanism of the 1954 coup was psychological dislocation. The goal wasn't to defeat the Guatemalan army militarily, that would have been too bloody and obvious. The goal was to convince the army that they had already lost. The CIA hired American pilots to fly unmarked P-47 Thunderbolts over Guatemala City. They dropped blocks of dynamite, not to destroy targets, but just to make loud noises. They dropped empty Coke bottles, which whistle terrifyingly as they fall. They blocked oil supplies to the country, paralysing transport. They bribed key military commanders, paying them to keep their troops in the barracks. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Arbenz sat in his palace, hearing the bombs, hearing the radio reports of thousands of invaders, and looking at his generals who refused to fight. He didn't know that the invasion was a bluff. He broke. On June 27, 1954, he resigned. The human tragedy of Arbenz is profound. He was stripped of search at the airport before being exiled, a final humiliation. He spent the rest of his life wandering from country to country, depressed and broken, before dying in a bathtub in Mexico under suspicious circumstances. Back in Guatemala, Castillo Armas took power. He was celebrated in the US as a hero of democracy. His first moves? He cancelled the elections. He burned the books. And, most importantly, he cancelled the agrarian reform. He took the land away from the peasants and gave it back to United Fruit. He abolished the taxes on interest and dividends to foreign investors. He banned labour unions. The communist threat evaporated overnight, because it was never there. The business climate, however, was suddenly perfect. The immediate consequence was a victory for Boston. The stock price stabilised, the bananas flowed. But the long-term consequence was a genocide. The coup destabilised Guatemala for 40 years. It triggered a civil war that lasted until 1996, killing over 200,000 people, mostly indigenous Mayans. The methods used by the US-backed regimes to suppress communism became increasingly horrific. United Fruit didn't just buy a government, they bought a nightmare. And ironically, the blowback eventually hit the company itself. The Banana Republic model was unsustainable. Antitrust laws in the US finally caught up with them. The brand became so toxic that they had to change their name. In 1970, the CEO of the successor company, Eli Black, smashed the window of his office in the Pan Am building in New York and jumped to his death. The guilt, or perhaps the stress of maintaining the empire, had become too much. The company didn't die with Eli Black. It mutated. In the late 20th century, United Fruit rebranded. They became United Brands, and eventually Chiquita Brands International. You know the sticker, the happy lady with the fruit hat, blue and yellow, friendly. It's a marketing masterpiece designed to make you forget the machine guns. But changing the logo didn't change the incentives. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Chiquita faced a familiar problem in Colombia. The region was unstable. Guerrillas and paramilitaries were fighting for control. A normal company might leave. Chiquita didn't. They did what Sam Zamuri would have done. They paid the men with the guns. The mechanism this time wasn't a coup. It was protection payments. From 1997 to 2004, Chiquita made over 100 payments totaling $1.7 million to the AUC, United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, a right-wing paramilitary group designated by the US government as a terrorist organization. These weren't small bribes at a checkpoint. These were processed through the corporate accounting department. They were listed in the books as security services. The AUC used that money to massacre civilians, displace peasants, and murder labour organisers. In 2007, Chiquita pleaded guilty in a US federal court to financing terrorism. They paid a $25 million fine. To a company with billions in revenue, $25 million isn't a punishment, it's a line item. It's the cost of doing business. The structure hadn't changed, it had just been invoiced differently. We like to think of the United Fruit story as ancient history. Sepia-toned photos of men in white suits. But look around. When a tech company negotiates a tax rate of 0.005% with a small European nation, that is the Zemurray concession model. When a rare earth miner hires private security to clear a village in the Congo, that is the Lee Christmas model. When an oil giant hires PR firms to shape the narrative on climate legislation, that is the Edward Bernays model. The Banana Republic wasn't a place, it was a method of stripping assets from the weak to feed the strong, using the state as a private enforcement arm. The bananas were just the delivery system. So, the next time you peel a banana, look at the sticker. Really look at it. It represents one of the most efficient logistics chains in human history. It represents cheap nutrition for billions. But it also represents a century of blood. United Fruit proved that if a corporation becomes powerful enough, the line between business and government dissolves. They proved that with enough money, you can buy not just the law, but reality itself. The terrifying part isn't that they got away with it for so long. The terrifying part is that the incentive structure that created United Fruit is still the operating system of the global economy. The drive for the lowest price, the highest margin, and the weakest regulation hasn't gone away. It has just moved to new industries. Data, lithium, water. They don't need the Great White Fleet anymore. They have servers. They don't need Lee Christmas. They have lawyers. The game hasn't ended, it just got faster. If you want to keep tracking the players who are really running the board, you know where to find us. Class dismissed.